At 12:52 that New Year's morning, I came down from the clock tower after fixing a chime that had not failed in 40 years and drove home to find my own garage lit up past midnight. My 17-year-old daughter was hunched over a sewing machine, fingers raw stitching another bride's gown. What she had hidden inside the hem is the reason I have not slept right since. I did not know any of that yet. Not the notebook, not the phone taped shut inside a seam, not the 3 videos that would take the floor out from under me before sunrise. That part comes later. First, you should know how a bell tower pulled me away from my own house on the one night I should have been standing in it. The call came at 6 that evening. Verlin Ash, who ran the town clock committee, was on the phone before I had even sat down to supper. "The chime is off, Emmett," he said. "Struck 1 when it should have struck 6. I told him I would go look." 40 years I had kept that mechanism running without a single missed strike, and I was not about to let it fail on New Year's Eve with half the town standing in the square waiting for midnight. My wife Priscilla did not ask me to stay home. She never did. "Go fix your bell," she said, and kissed my cheek at the door the way she always did, warm and quick and perfectly timed. I did not think anything of it. That was the whole problem with Priscilla. Nothing she ever did looked like anything. I drove the 11 minutes to the square with my toolbox on the seat beside me. The bell had not actually failed. That was the strange part, and I should have paid more attention to it than I did. A tower mechanism does not simply misfire once and correct itself on its own. Something has to knock a gear loose, and something has to knock it back into place. I found the striking lever bent slightly, as if a hand, not a fault, had pushed it. I straightened it, tested the chime twice, and told myself it was old metal settling in the cold. I did not know then that I would spend the whole drive home turning that thought over the way I turn over every strange thing I find in my work, looking for the cause instead of just patching the symptom. If I had known what was waiting for me in my garage, I might have driven straight there and skipped the tower altogether. But that is not how repair work goes. You cannot skip to the end. You have to walk the whole system one connection at a time, or you miss the thing that matters. It was 12:40 when I turned onto Birch Hollow Road. The house sat dark except for the garage where a thin strip of yellow light showed under the door. I cut my headlights out of habit the way I always do coming home late so I would not wake anyone. Then I heard it. A sewing machine running fast and steady at nearly 1 in the morning. I opened the side door without knocking because it was my own garage. What I found was not my garage anymore. 2 industrial sewing machines stood where my workbench used to be. Bolts of white satin were stacked against the wall where I kept my winter tires. A folding table held a metal cash box and a stack of order forms with a hand-lettered sign taped above it that read, "Cross Family Bridal." My sister-in-law Marlene stood over a dress form, pinning a bodice with quick, practiced hands. Her son Cormac sat in a folding chair with his headphones on, scrolling his phone, a pile of unfolded tablecloths at his feet. He had clearly been told to fold and had not touched. And in the far corner, under a single clamp lamp, my daughter Wren sat at the second machine with a wedding gown spread across her lap, the hem trailing onto the bare concrete. Her fingertips were red and cracked at the edges. She did not look up right away. She was counting stitches under her breath, the way she counted most things, now careful and quiet, like a girl who had learned that silence was the safest thing she owned. Marlene saw me first. She set her pins down slowly, the way a person sets down something they do not want to seem caught holding. "Emmett," she said. "You're back early." I did not answer her. I was looking at my daughter's hands. Cormac pulled one earbud out, glanced at me and put it back in without a word, as if my standing in the doorway of my own garage at 1 in the morning required no further comment from him at all. Priscilla's voice reached me before I saw her coming through the door that connected the garage to the kitchen, bright and easy. "Emmett, you're home." "How was the tower?" I told her I would explain later. She kept talking anyway, something about a rush order for a spring wedding, about how good it was for Marlene to finally be back on her feet, about how these late nights would not last forever. I let her talk. In 34 years of listening to machines, I had learned that the ones lying to you are usually the loudest. I asked how long this had been going on. Marlene answered before Priscilla could. 6 weeks, she said, like it was nothing, like she was reporting a weather pattern. We had 3 fittings booked for tomorrow and 1 rush order due Monday. Ren has been such a help. I looked at the order forms stacked on the folding table. 11 names. 11 deposits, each one circled in blue ink in a hand I recognized as Priscilla's. I asked Ren how much of those 6 weeks she had spent standing at that machine past midnight. She did not answer. Marlene answered for her again. "Kids need responsibility, Emmett. It builds character." I looked at my daughter's hands, the raw pads of her fingers, where the needle guard had slipped more than once, and I did not say anything for a moment, because I did not trust what would come out if I opened my mouth too soon. Cormac stood up, then stretching unbothered, and said something about needing a snack, and walked past me into the kitchen, like the whole scene meant nothing at all. Priscilla watched him go, and did not call him back to the tablecloths, still sitting folded in the chair. Ren looked up last. When she saw me standing there, something crossed her face, fast gone, before I could name it fully. Then she said the only thing anyone said to me that whole night that made any sense at all. "Dad, you weren't supposed to be back until morning." She said it fast, the way you say something you have rehearsed without meaning to. Behind her, the machine was still running, needle paused mid-stitch in the pale satin of a stranger's hem. Nobody in that room moved. 40 minutes later, I would be standing in a room that used to hold my wife's sewing machine, looking at a mattress on the floor and a number written in pencil on the wall. A number that would not leave my head for months. But first, I had to get my daughter out of that garage, and I had exactly 1 tool for that. I crossed to the breaker panel on the far wall, the one I had wired myself 20 years ago, and I cut the power to the whole garage. Both machines died mid-stitch. The lamp over Ren's table went dark. Marlene's voice came out sharp in the sudden black. "Emmett, what are you doing? We have fittings tomorrow." I did not answer her. I said one thing to my daughter in a voice I kept level on purpose. "Ren, get your coat. We're going inside." She did not move right away. I heard her chair scrape back slowly, the way you move when you are not sure the ground under you is solid. Priscilla's hand found my arm in the dark. "Emmett, honey, let's not do this in front of everyone," she said, her voice pitched low and reasonable, the way she pitched everything. I told her the same thing I had just told Ren. "We're going inside." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Cormac said something behind me about the cash box, about clients getting refunds if the machines sat too long mid-run, and I told him the machines would keep. Marlene said my name twice more sharper each time. Priscilla tried once more too, her hand still on my arm. "We can talk about this like adults, Emmett, in the morning, when everyone's calmer." I told her I was calm. I meant it. I had never felt less like raising my voice and more like finishing something in my life, I walked toward the side door with my hand on Ren's shoulder and did not turn around. We crossed the yard in the cold, without jackets, both of us, because neither of us had thought to grab one. I opened the kitchen door, and we went in through the mud room, past the boots lined up along the wall, hers smaller than they used to be. The house was quiet in a different way than the garage had been quiet. Not empty. Just paused. I asked her where she had been sleeping. She did not answer at first. She led instead down the hallway past the bathroom, past a door with a strip of masking tape still stuck to the frame, her name written on it in handwriting from when she was maybe 8 years old, still labeling things the way kids do. That door was closed now. A blue light showed underneath it, and the low bass thump of something Cormac had left running in his room, the room that used to be hers. She kept walking. At the end of the hall was a smaller door, the one that used to lead to Addie's sewing room. I asked her, without meaning to sound as tired as it came out, whether Cormac's door had always had that lock on the outside knob, the kind you could turn with a coin. She said she did not know when it was installed. She said she had stopped asking questions about things that changed in that house months ago because the answer was always the same word: temporary. Ren stopped in front of the sewing room door and put her hand on the knob and did not turn it right away. I asked her what was in there. She said you should probably just see it. Then she opened the door and stepped inside, and I followed her. The room was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people standing apart. Addie's old sewing machine still sat against the far wall, unused boxes stacked on top of it, now instead of fabric. A pegboard still held her spools of thread and a pair of shears she had used for 20 years, untouched the way things get left when nobody decides to move them and nobody decides to use them either. On the floor beneath the pegboard was a camping mattress, thin, the kind that comes rolled in a bag. A sleeping bag was folded on top of it instead of a blanket. Ren's backpack sat against the wall. Her shoes were lined up beside the mattress toes, pointed the same direction, the kind of neatness that comes from a person trying to take up as little space as they possibly can. Above the mattress, taped to the wall with a single strip of blue painter's tape, so it would not damage the paint, was a photograph of her mother. I recognized it. Addie at a county fair, maybe 8 years back, laughing at something outside the frame, her hand raised to block the sun. Below the photograph, also taped to the wall, was a small square of paper. I stepped closer to read before I understood what I was looking at. A number written in pencil, crossed out and rewritten smaller, each time 4 revisions at least. The current number was circled twice, 211. I did not ask what it counted down to yet. I did not trust my own voice to ask it steadily, and some part of me already suspected the answer would not be one I could hear standing up. I asked her instead quietly how long she had been sleeping in this room. She did not answer right away. She stood in the middle of the narrow space with her arms wrapped around herself, watching my face the way you watch someone reading a verdict, waiting to see which way it would land before she said anything more. Since August, she said finally. Cormac needed the guest room. Priscilla said it was temporary. I asked how long temporary had turned out to mean. She looked at the mattress instead of at me. 5 months, she said. It's fine. I've made it work. I looked at the sleeping bag, at the shoes lined up too carefully, at the mother's photograph taped just high enough that Ren would see it every night before she turned off the light. I thought about the workbench in the garage, my tools pushed to the edges to make room for 2 machines and 11 paying strangers. And I thought about how a man can walk past a closed door in his own house for 5 months and never once open it. I did not say any of that to her. I said, I need you to tell me what's under that mattress. Something shifted in her face. Then a kind of bracing, like she had been waiting a long time for someone to ask her that exact question, and had almost stopped believing it would happen. She knelt down beside the mattress without answering and slid her hand underneath it. The fourth box came off the machine, and beneath it sat a wedding gown, half-finished, draped over the machine bed, the way a body might be draped over a table sleeves, pinned-back bodice still bristling with basting thread. It was the kind of ivory satin that catches lamplight and holds it the way water holds the moon, still and cold, and giving nothing back. Wren lifted it out carefully, laid it across her lap, the way she must have done 100 times at that machine in the garage, and turned the hem inside out. A seam had been picked open along 6 inches of the inner lining, and resewn with looser stitches, uneven compared to the rest of the careful work around it. Stitches a trained eye would catch in half a second, and a distracted one would miss for months. She worked her fingers into the gap and drew out a small memory card sealed in a scrap of plastic wrap. I asked her what that was. "A copy," she said, "of everything on the phone, in case anyone ever found the phone first." I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the gown across her lap, at the hidden seam, at the small card in her palm, and I understood that my daughter had built herself a second line of defense sometime in the last few months. Quietly, the way a person builds something when they have stopped believing the first line will hold on its own. 17 years old, and she had already learned to plan for the version of events where nobody came to help in time. I asked her whose gown that was. She said it belonged to a bride getting married in March, a woman named Colette, who had no idea any of this was happening inside the fabric she had paid a deposit on. I told her we would deal with that later. Right now, I needed to see what was on the phone. She unlocked it and handed it to me, then sat back against the wall, knees drawn up, and told me she did not want to watch again. I told her she did not have to. The first video was 14 seconds long. Marlene in the garage sliding bills out of a tip jar and into her own apron pocket, while Wren's back was turned at the machine, then calling out "all done for today" before Wren had even noticed the jar was lighter. The second was shorter. Cormac dumping an armful of dirty linens on the folding table where Wren was working, saying, "These are yours now," and walking off before she could answer. Both of those made my jaw tighten. Neither of them was the reason my hands went still on the phone. The third video ran 2 minutes and 11 seconds. It opened on a hallway filmed low, the angle suggesting the phone had been held down at hip height, hidden. Isla's voice faint off camera. Priscilla's voice came through clearer, close to the lens. "I'm not doing this again this year," Priscilla said. "She can sit it out." Then a door closing. Then the distinct, unmistakable click of a lock turning from the outside. Behind the door, muffled Wren's voice. "It's my birthday. Please." The video did not answer her. It just kept recording the closed door, the hallway, faint laughter and cake-cutting sounds, drifting from somewhere else in the house for a full 90 more seconds before it cut off. I looked up from the phone. Wren was watching my face exactly the way she had warned me she would. I asked her how long she had been locked in that room. 2 hours, she said. Isla let me out when everyone went to bed. She'd been standing outside the door most of that time. She just couldn't say anything, or Aunt Marlene would have known she'd given me the phone. I did not trust myself to speak for a while after that. The furnace ticked somewhere below the floor, 3 slow clicks, then quiet. Down the hall, the bass thump from Cormac's room kept its same steady rhythm, indifferent to everything happening on this side of the wall. A car passed outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, and gone. I set the phone face down on the mattress. My hands stayed where I put them, flat on my knees, not shaking exactly, just still in a way they had not been still in a very long time. Wren did not fill the silence either. She sat with her arms around her knees and waited the way she had clearly learned to wait for a great many things in that room. When I could talk again, I told Wren to pack a bag. Just for tonight. She asked where we were going. I told her Tobias and Rosalind's that they had a spare room and would not ask questions we did not have answers for yet. She did not argue. She packed quickly the notebook and phone and memory card, all going into the same bag, wrapped now in a sweatshirt instead of a pillowcase. And we left through the kitchen without passing the garage again. I heard voices behind the closed door as we went Marlene's, then Priscilla's, low and fast, already working out what story they would tell me in the morning. I did not go back to ask. Some repairs I have learned you do not attempt while the power is still live. The drive to Tobias and Rosalind's took 9 minutes. Neither of us spoke for most of it. Wren sat with the bag on her lap, both hands pressed flat on top of it, the way you hold something down in wind. Rosalind answered the door in her robe before I had even finished knocking, took one look at Wren's face, and did not ask a single question. She just held the door open wider and said, "Come in, both of you. The kettle's still warm from earlier." Tobias appeared behind her a moment later, already reaching for the extra blanket he kept folded on the hall chair for exactly this kind of night. Though we had never once needed it before. I stood in their doorway a moment longer than I meant to. My daughter already passed me and into the warm kitchen light, and I understood, standing there in the cold, that whatever came next was not going to be something I could fix quietly from the outside, the way I had fixed every other broken thing in my life. This one was going to require me to walk all the way in and stay there. Rosalind put Wren to bed in the guest room within 20 minutes, tucking a second quilt around her, though the house was warm enough without it, the kind of unnecessary kindness people offer when words have run out. I told them both I needed air. Tobias walked me to the door without asking why, which is one of the reasons he has been my friend for 22 years. I sat in my truck in their driveway for a long while, engine off, hands on the wheel, not driving anywhere. I found myself thinking about the night Addie died 5 years back now. Though some nights it still feels like a season ago and not a life ago. She had asked me near the end to promise her one thing, and it was not the thing most people ask for. She did not ask me to keep the house standing or the business running or my grief contained. She asked me not to let Wren feel like she was carrying any of it alone. Don't let her feel like she's the only one holding the weight, Emmett. Promise me that. I had promised it easily, the way you promise anything to a dying woman, meaning it completely, and understanding almost none of what it would actually require of me. I thought about the night I met Priscilla 18 months after the funeral at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department that Rosalind had all but dragged me to. Priscilla had asked about the clock tower before anyone else at that party had thought to ask about anything of mine at all. She had listened the way almost nobody listens, remembering small details I mentioned only once, bringing them back up weeks later, like they mattered to her the way they mattered to me. I had thought, at the time, that this was simply what attention felt like from someone who was paying it. I did not yet know how much of it could be manufactured, and how convincingly by someone who had decided in advance exactly what she wanted it to earn her. I thought about the wedding, small and quiet at the courthouse, Wren, 15 years old, and cautiously hopeful in a green dress she picked out herself. She had hugged Priscilla afterward right there on the courthouse steps, and I remembered feeling something loosen in my chest at the sight of it. Some tension I had been carrying since Addie died without fully realizing how heavy it had gotten. I thought at the time that I was watching my daughter get a mother back. I understand now. that I was watching the opening move of something else entirely and mistaking it for the thing I most wanted to see. I thought about how ordinary the first months had felt, how unremarkable right up until the point where nothing about that house had been ordinary in a very long time, and I had somehow failed to notice the exact moment it stopped. There was a night early on, maybe 4 months into the marriage, when I had come home to find Wren doing dishes that were not hers, humming along without complaint. And I remembered thinking simply how good of her. Not once did I ask why a 15-year-old was clearing plates for 4 adults who were perfectly capable of clearing their own. I had read that moment as kindness. I understand now it was the first small test of what she would tolerate without pushing back, and she had passed it, quietly the way she was raised to pass most tests, and nobody had thought to check whether passing it was costing her anything at all. I made myself remember it in order the way I trace a stalled mechanism back to its source, instead of guessing at the failure point. 3 weeks after the wedding, Cormac had shown up saying his lease had fallen through just for a few weeks. He'd said sleeping in his car until then, could he just crash on the couch. 6 weeks after that, Marlene and Isla arrived to burst pipe at Marlene's rental temporary. Everyone kept saying temporary, until temporary had become the only word that house seemed to know how to use. I thought about the garage. My workbench had gone first pushed to one wall to make room for a single sewing table. Then the table had multiplied into 2. Then the tire rack had come down. Then, at some point I could not pin to a single day, my garage had become a business with a hand-lettered sign and 11 paying strangers and a girl who used to fall asleep in that workbench's shadow doing her homework while I fixed small engines, sewing wedding gowns alone at 1 in the morning instead. None of it had happened all at once. That was what I kept circling back to, sitting there in the cold truck. A house does not fail the way a bell tower fails one dramatic silence in front of a whole waiting town. It fails the way rust does. Quietly from the inside in places nobody thinks to check, because everything on the surface still looks like it is holding. I thought about the notebook. 83 days in a hand, steadier than mine had been all night. I thought about the number on the wall above her mattress, 211 counted down and recounted, and I understood without needing to ask that it was counting down to her 18th birthday, to the day she would legally be able to walk out that door and never look back. I did not want my daughter counting days until she could leave her own home. I wanted more than I have wanted almost anything in 5 years, to give her a house worth staying in instead. Sitting there, I thought about Franklin Odom, the family lawyer who had handled Addie's estate and who I had not spoken to in 3 years. I thought about the bank and whether I had ever actually read the paperwork Priscilla had slid across the kitchen table for me to sign back in March, the insurance forms I remembered initialing quickly, between shifts, trusting her summary of what they said instead of reading them myself. I did not know yet how much of that trust had already cost me. I only knew, sitting in that cold truck with my daughter finally asleep under someone else's roof, that I was done fixing this quietly from the outside, the way I had been fixing everything else in my life, for longer than I wanted to admit. There was work to do, and for the first time all night, I knew exactly where to start. I knocked on Corwin Ashby's door at 6:58 the next morning, earlier than any reasonable neighbor calls on another. But Corwin answered, fully dressed, coffee already in hand, like he had been expecting someone to knock on that door for months, and had simply been waiting to find out which morning it would be. He is 60 years old, a retired postal inspector, who spent 3 decades noticing things other people were paid not to notice. And he has lived next door to me for 11 years, without either of us needing more from the other than a wave across the fence line most mornings. He did not wave that morning. He stepped back and held the door open and said, "Come in, Emmett," before I had said a word about why I was there. I asked him if he had noticed anything unusual coming from my house in the past several months. He did not answer right away. He set his coffee down on the counter, walked into the next room, and came back with a manila folder, thick enough that it needed a rubber band to hold it closed. He set it on the table between us and said, "I started keeping these back in July. I wasn't sure it was my business. I still don't know that it is, but I kept thinking somebody should have a record in case one was ever needed." Inside the folder were photographs, 23 of them by my count, each one with a date and time written on the back in pencil in handwriting so careful it looked almost typed. Wren carrying trash bags to the curb at 11 at night. Wren scraping ice off the garage windows before dawn on a school day. Wren sitting alone on the porch steps in October, arms wrapped around her knees, the kitchen window behind her, lit and full of shapes that were clearly other people. None of them her. I asked him why he had never said anything to me directly. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "Corwin is not a man who apologizes quickly." And I could see the apology working its way toward the surface before he let it out. "I told myself it wasn't my place," he said. "I told myself you'd notice on your own eventually, and that I'd only be causing trouble getting between a man and his family. I was wrong about both of those things, and I've had 6 months to sit with being wrong about them." I told him I understood. I'm not sure I fully did not yet, standing in his kitchen with 23 photographs spread across the table like a case file nobody had asked him to build. But I understood enough to know he had done something I had not done myself, in the same house, watching the same girl for a great deal longer than 6 months. I asked to keep the folder. He said it was mine before I finished asking. From Corwin's kitchen, I called Dottie Reyes, a client of the shop who had been getting her hair set there since before Priscilla ever moved in, back when it had just been a garage and my old workbench and nothing more. Dottie answered on the second ring, already talking, before I could finish explaining why I was calling. "I've been wondering when somebody would ask me about that girl," she said. "I've watched Marlene take tip money right out of that child's apron pocket 3 times now, right in front of me, like I wasn't even sitting there. Once I tried to hand Wren a 5, directly put it right in her hand, and Marlene had it out of her fingers before Wren even said thank you. I asked her if she would be willing to say that to someone else if it came to that. 'I'll say it to anyone who asks,' Dottie said. 'I've been going to that garage for 30 years, off and on. I'm not about to stop being honest about what I see in it now, just because it's uncomfortable.' I thanked her and told her I would likely be in touch again soon. She told me to take care of that girl in a tone that made it clear she considered the instruction more important than anything else I might do that day. Before I hung up, she added one more thing. She said Marlene had mentioned once in passing something about the shop needing to bring in more before spring, before Wren's college fund came due for renewal, whatever that meant. Dottie said she had not thought much of it at the time. She said she was thinking about it plenty now. I asked her to repeat exactly what Marlene had said, word for word, if she could manage it. Dottie thought for a moment, then gave me the sentence again, slower this time. Careful with it, the way a person handles something they have decided might matter more than they first realized. I wrote it down on the back of one of Corwin's envelopes before I could lose the exact wording. I went back to Corwin's photographs after I hung up, laying them out in order across his kitchen table by date, the way I lay out parts on a workbench before I start diagnosing what's actually wrong with a mechanism instead of guessing at it. The last photograph in the folder stopped me longer than any of the others. Dated October 14th, time stamped 7:41 in the evening. Wren standing outside the kitchen window in the cold, in a coat too thin for the season, looking in through the glass at something happening inside. I could make out balloons in the background, a cake with candles, still lit shapes of people laughing around a table. Wren was not among them. She was outside looking in, on what I now understood was her own 17th birthday. Corwin told me he had taken that one from his own porch, almost by accident, meaning to photograph nothing more than the frost pattern on his railing. He said he had not understood what he was looking at until he developed it and saw her face clearly enough to read it. I asked him how long she had stood there. 11 minutes and 40 seconds, he said. I timed it on my phone once I realized what I was watching. I almost went out to get her myself. I've regretted every day since that I didn't. I folded the photograph carefully back into the stack, thanked him again, and told him I had one more stop to make before the day was done. He asked if I needed company. I told him not yet, but that I would likely need him to say all of this again to someone whose job it was to listen. Millhaven High School opened its front office at 7:30. I was standing at the counter at 7:31, and Principal Marguerite Okafor came out to meet me herself rather than send a secretary, which told me something about how the morning was already going to go before either of us said a word. She led me into her office and closed the door. I told her I needed to understand what the school's records showed about my daughter's well-being over the past several months. She pulled up a file on her computer, read it silently for a moment, and her expression changed in a way I recognized, because it was close to the expression I imagine I had been wearing myself since 1 in the morning. According to this, she said, your daughter has been receiving weekly counseling sessions with our school psychologist since September. Written up, dated, signed off. I asked her whose signature was on those sign-offs. She turned the screen toward me. Priscilla Cross listed as primary guardian contact, initialing each session as confirmed. I told her Wren had never once mentioned any counseling to me. Marguerite picked up her phone and called the school psychologist, directly someone named Renata Bishop, and asked her plainly whether she had actually met with Wren Cross on any of the 12 dates listed in that file. I could hear the answer through the receiver even from where I sat. No. Not once this school year. She said she remembered flagging Wren's name back in September for a wellness check after a teacher raised concerns and being told by the front office that the family had already arranged private counseling and did not wish the school to duplicate services. Marguerite asked who had told her that. Renata said it had come through as a note attached to Wren's file, no name on it. Just an administrative flag. Marguerite looked at me for a long moment after she hung up. Someone entered that note manually, she said. That's not automated. Somebody sat at a keyboard and typed it in. She pulled Wren's attendance and grade records next. Without my asking the way a person moves, once they have decided a situation calls for more than the minimum. Attendance was fine. Grades had dropped not dramatically but steadily since August, in a pattern any teacher would call a student who's struggling with something at home. Marguerite said 3 different teachers had left notes in the system over the fall semester, concerns about Wren seeming exhausted, one about a paper submitted with a visible burn mark on the corner, as though it had been rescued from too close to a stove. Every note had received the same automated response. Family aware. Support in place. I asked who generated those responses. They're supposed to be generated after a call home confirms the concern has been addressed, Marguerite said. Which means somebody was taking those calls and telling 3 separate teachers that everything was handled when apparently nothing was. Before I left, she walked me down the hall to the art room where Wren's teacher, a woman named Ingrid Lindqvist, was setting up easels for the first class of the day. Marguerite explained briefly why I was there. Ingrid did not look surprised. She set down the stack of paper she was holding, walked to a supply closet, and came back with a portfolio folder, Wren's name written on the tab in Ingrid's own careful handwriting. "I need you to see these," Ingrid said. "I've been keeping them separate from her regular assignments since October." I didn't know what else to do with what I was seeing other than not let them get thrown away at the end of term like everything else. She opened the folder on a table between us. A dozen drawings, charcoal, mostly a few in ink. The first was a figure behind a window, looking out, hands pressed flat against the glass. The second was a single door drawn from inside a small room, no handle on the visible side. The third was a girl at a sewing machine, faceless, the machine rendered in obsessive, exact detail, every gear and needle correct, while the figure operating it had no features at all. I asked Ingrid if Wren had ever said anything about what these meant. She said Wren never explained her work, not once all semester, which was itself unusual for a girl who used to narrate every piece she made when she first started in this class 2 years ago. I asked what she used to be like. Ingrid said she used to draw her mother constantly from photographs, from memory, warm portraits, soft lines. She said sometime around August, the subject matter had changed entirely, and so had the technique. Sharper lines, enclosed spaces, nothing warm left in any of it. I asked to take the folder with me. Ingrid said she had been hoping I would ask. I carried it out to my truck in the school parking lot. The 23 photographs from Corwin still on the passenger seat, the folder now beside them, and I sat there a moment before starting the engine, looking at the two collections side by side, a neighbor's careful, pencil-dated evidence, and a 17-year-old's careful drawings, both of them saying the same thing in a different language. Both of them things nobody in that house had thought to hand me until now. I flipped through the drawings once more before I pulled out of the lot. Near the bottom of the stack was one I had missed the first time, through smaller than the others, done in colored pencil instead of charcoal. Two figures at a kitchen table, unmistakably Addie and a much younger Wren, both of them smiling, a plate of something between them. Dated in the corner faintly was a month from 3 years before Addie died. I understood, looking at it, that Wren had not stopped remembering the good years. She had simply stopped believing anyone wanted to see them, alongside everything that came after. I called Franklin Odom from the parking lot before I drove anywhere else. I told him what: the notebook, the phone, the memory card. 23 photographs, a fabricated counseling record, and a folder of drawings that told the same story from a different angle entirely. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "That's more than enough to start building something formal," he said. "But Emmett, before we go further, I need you to think carefully about the money. If there's a pattern like this in the house, there's usually a pattern like it in the accounts too. I want you at the bank today, not next week." I told him I was already headed there. Louisa Whitcomb had managed my accounts at Millhaven Savings for 11 years, long enough to know me by name before I reached the counter, long enough that when I asked her to pull every statement connected to my accounts for the past 16 months, she did not ask why. She simply printed them, all of them, and led me to the small conference room at the back of the branch, where they handled things that took more than a signature. I asked her first about Wren's education fund, the one Addie had opened the week Wren was born, and that I had added to steadily every year since. Louisa pulled it up and went quiet in a way I was starting to recognize as the particular silence of someone reading numbers that did not match what they expected to see. "There have been regular withdrawals," she said, "going back 16 months, all of them under $1,200 each." She turned the screen toward me. I counted them myself right there at the table. 31 withdrawals. Never the same amount twice. Never enough on their own to trigger the automatic flag our system sets for anything over that threshold. I asked her what the total came to. $26,100, she said. I asked her to read me the dates. She did one by one, and I wrote them down on the back of an envelope from my jacket pocket, matching them against what I already knew. The first withdrawal fell 3 weeks after the wedding. The most recent had gone through 11 days ago while I was at the tower fixing a chime that had never once failed in 34 years. I asked who had authorized them. Louisa said the account had 2 authorized signers, myself, and Priscilla added as a joint contact. The year we married, a decision I remembered making at the time as a simple courtesy, a way of saying I trusted her with something that mattered to me. Every withdrawal on the list bore Priscilla's authorization code, not mine. I sat with that number for a moment before I asked my next question, because some part of me was still hoping the next thing Louisa found would be smaller. It was not smaller. She pulled up my life insurance policy next to the one I had carried since before Wren was born, the one that had always listed Wren as sole beneficiary. Louisa read the current beneficiary designation twice before she said it out loud, as though she wanted to be sure of it before she handed it to me. The beneficiary was changed in March, she said. It now lists Priscilla Cross as primary beneficiary at 100%. There's a form on file with your signature. I asked to see it. She printed it and slid it across the table. I remembered the morning she was describing, or thought I did, a Tuesday in March. Priscilla sliding a small stack of papers across the kitchen table while I was finishing coffee before a shift, saying something about updating our information now that we were officially past our 1-year mark. Initial, here and here, nothing complicated. I remembered signing quickly. The way a man signs things he trusts have already been explained to him honestly. The way I had signed 100 forms over a lifetime without reading every line, because that had never once cost me anything before. My signature on the page in front of me was mine. I could not deny that. What I could no longer believe was that I had understood in that kitchen what I was actually signing. I asked Louisa whether a change like that would have required any confirmation from the insurance carrier itself, a phone call, anything beyond a signed form. She said typically, yes, a verification call went out within a week of any beneficiary change, and she would need to check with the carrier directly to see whether that call had actually reached me or been redirected somehow. I told her I did not remember any such call. She wrote the question down on a legal pad and underlined it twice. I asked Louisa what I needed to do to freeze the accounts and reverse what could still be reversed. She walked me through it clearly, professionally, the way a person walks you through a procedure they have unfortunately had to explain to other people before. Freeze forms for the joint accounts. A fraud claim filed against the withdrawal pattern, which the bank would investigate on its own timeline, but which at minimum would stop it from continuing. The insurance change would take longer, a separate process through the carrier, but she gave me the number to call and told me to ask specifically for their fraud unit rather than general customer service. I signed everything she put in front of me. My hand was steady. I want that on the record, if only for myself. My hand was steady the entire time, even though nothing else in me was. When it was done, Louisa walked me back out to the lobby. She did not say anything else about the numbers, which I was grateful for. At the door, she only said, "Take care of yourself, Emmett," in the same tone Dottie had used about Wren the day before, and I understood that word had apparently already started moving through this town faster than I had. I sat in the bank parking lot afterward without starting the truck. The cold came in slowly through the door seal, the kind of cold that takes a while to notice once you stop moving. A delivery van pulled in two spaces over its brakes, releasing with a long hiss, then quiet again. Someone's dog barked twice from an open window across the lot and stopped. A shopping cart rolled loose across the far end of the lot, pushed by nothing but wind, and came to rest against a curb with a small metallic clatter. I watched it settle. I did not turn the key. I sat with both statements folded on the seat beside me, the withdrawal history and the insurance form, and I found I could not for a while make myself reach for the phone. When I finally did, I called Tobias not to tell him everything yet, only to hear a voice that had known me before any of this, and to say the only sentence I could manage clearly. I need you to help me figure out what to do next. He did not ask what had happened. He only said, "Come by whenever you're ready. We'll be here," and hung up, so I would not feel obligated to explain myself before I was ready to. I found Priscilla in the kitchen when I got home that evening, stirring something on the stove like it was any other Tuesday. She turned when she heard me, and her face did the thing it always did when she wanted something to look easy. Soft around the eyes. A small patient smile, the kind you give someone you are prepared to forgive before they have even asked for it. "Emmett," she said. I was starting to worry. "You've been gone a long time." I told her I had needed to think. "That's fair," she said, setting down her spoon and turning to face me fully. "Last night got out of hand. I know it did. I should have told you what was happening in the garage before you had to find out at 1 a.m. like that." "I'm sorry." I watched her say it. I have spent 34 years learning to tell the difference between a sound that means something is actually wrong and a sound that only mimics one, and I could not, standing in that kitchen, find a single crack in how convincingly sorry she managed to look. I told her I did not want to lose this marriage. I want to be honest about why I said it. It was not true, not in the way she understood it. But I had learned enough in 34 years of repair work to know that some systems cannot be dismantled safely while they are still live and humming, believing themselves undiscovered. You do not walk up to a failing structure and announce which beam you intend to pull first. You isolate it quietly, one connection at a time, and you do not let the structure know it is already coming down until it has nowhere left to stand. Priscilla crossed the kitchen and put her arms around me, and I let her, and I hated how easily my body still remembered the shape of that particular comfort, even with everything I now knew sitting folded in my truck outside. She said she knew last night had frightened me. She said things had gotten a little out of hand with the shop, that she would talk to Marlene about scaling it back, that we would figure out a better arrangement for Wren's hours. She said all of this softly, reasonably, the way she said everything. And for one unsteady second, I understood exactly how a person could live inside that voice for 2 years without ever fully waking up. I told her I appreciated that. I asked nothing else that night. I went to bed early and lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, and I thought about Franklin's instructions from that afternoon. "Check every document with both your names on it," he had told me over the phone. "Not just accounts. Property contracts, anything either of you has signed jointly in the last 2 years. People who move money quietly rarely stop at money. They tend to attach themselves to whatever else has value." The next morning, while Priscilla was at the shop, I went through the fireproof box I kept in the hall closet, the one with our deeds and policies and the paperwork from the town contract for the clock tower, the one I had held with the town of Millhaven for going on 9 years now, renewed every 3 without much ceremony. The current renewal, signed 8 months ago, listed 2 names on the maintenance agreement. Mine, and beneath it, added in a section I did not remember discussing, Priscilla Cross, co-holder effective, the same month as the insurance change. I sat on the closet floor with that page in my hands for a long while. The tower contract was not simply a job to me. It was the one thing in that town that had my name on it before Priscilla ever existed in my life, a piece of Millhaven that belonged to my hands and nobody else's. I had won that contract in a bid against two other clocksmiths from as far off as Burlington, back when I was younger than Cormac is now. And I had kept it for 34 years on nothing but the quality of the work. I could not remember signing anything that added a second name to it. I could not remember a conversation about it at all. And I went through the box twice more, looking for an earlier version of the page that might explain when the change had actually happened, and found none. I called Franklin back and read him the document over the phone. He was quiet for a moment, the same quiet Louisa had gone into at the bank, the sound of someone recalibrating what kind of situation they were actually looking at. "That's not incidental, Emmett," he said. "Co-holder status on a municipal maintenance contract isn't something that happens by accident, and it isn't something most spouses would think to ask for. Somebody wanted her name attached to something that will outlast the marriage on paper, regardless of what happens to the marriage itself." I told him I did not understand why anyone would want that specific thing. The contract paid modestly. It carried no real value beyond the pride I took in it. Franklin said he did not have an answer for that yet either, but that it was worth remembering because motives that do not make sense on the surface usually mean you have not found the real one underneath. I put the folder back in the box and drove to the bank that afternoon to finalize the freeze on the accounts. When I got home, Priscilla was setting the table for dinner, humming something under her breath, and she asked me lightly whether I had gotten around to depositing that check from the Hutchins estate job. I told her I had. It was not true. I had not touched the Hutchins check in 3 days. I said it anyway, evenly, without a flicker, and watched her nod and go back to setting plates, satisfied, unsuspecting. And I understood in that moment that I had just told my wife a smooth, easy lie for the first time in my life, and that some part of me that used to find lying difficult had gone quiet without my permission. Her card declined at the grocery store the next morning. She called me from the parking lot, confused, asking if I knew what might have happened. I told her banks made mistakes sometimes, that I would look into it, and I kept my voice as level as the one I had used on Wren the night I cut the power. She called again an hour later, saying she had used the emergency cash from the junk drawer to cover the groceries, and asking almost as an afterthought whether I had noticed anything strange in the mail lately, any letters from the bank. I told her I had not been checking the mail closely. She said she would grab it when she got home then. I told her that was fine, and hung up before my voice could give away how carefully I was tracking every question she asked me now, listening less for the words themselves than for what she seemed to already suspect underneath them. I was getting better at this than I wanted to be. I met Priscilla at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department 18 months after Addie died in the community hall behind the Methodist church, where half the town's important nothings and somethings tend to happen. Rosalind had all but pulled me there by the sleeve, insisting I needed to stop eating dinner alone in front of the television, and I had gone mostly to stop her asking. Priscilla was working the dessert table when I first saw her, and she was the only person at that entire event who asked me a question about the clock tower instead of a question about Addie. Most people, meaning well, wanted to know how I was holding up a question. I had grown to dread the way you dread a diagnosis you already know the answer to. Priscilla asked instead how long it took to true a pendulum after a hard freeze, and listened to the actual answer all 4 minutes of it, without her eyes drifting once toward the door. I told her about the escapement mechanism, the part of the clock that converts falling weight into a steady measured tick instead of a single uncontrolled drop. She said that sounded like most things worth doing, a slow conversion of something heavy into something you could actually live inside. I have thought about that sentence more times since than I want to admit. We talked for the better part of an hour that first night, longer than I had talked to anyone since the funeral. She asked about Ren carefully, the way you ask about a child you have not yet met, but already suspect matters more than anything else in the conversation. She asked what Ren liked to draw. I did not know the answer well enough at the time to give her a good one, and I remember feeling faintly embarrassed by that, though I could not have said exactly why. She mentioned that first night almost in passing, that her first marriage had not gone the way she had planned. I asked what happened. She said only that her ex-husband had lost his business a few years back, and that the loss had changed him into someone she no longer recognized enough to stay married to. She said it lightly, the way you mention an old scar you have stopped noticing on your own skin, and I did not press for more. I had my own losses I did not care to detail on a first conversation, and I extended her the same courtesy I wanted extended to me. We married 2 years later, small at the courthouse, Ren 15, and cautiously hopeful in a green dress she had picked out herself. I remember thinking, watching Priscilla straighten Ren's collar before the ceremony, that I had somehow found my way back to something resembling a whole family, after 2 years of believing that particular door had closed for good. The first months were by any measure I had at the time good ones. Priscilla learned the names of every regular at Dottie's Tuesday appointment. She packed Ren's lunches with little notes, some mornings, small kindnesses that cost her nothing, and meant, I thought then, everything. She learned my schedule at the tower faster than I had expected, knew which weeks the maintenance rounds ran long, had dinner ready, and waiting on those nights, without my having to say a word about it. I told Tobias once early, that first year, that I felt like a man who had been handed a second chance he had stopped believing he deserved. 3 weeks after the wedding, Cormac showed up on a Friday evening with 2 duffel bags and an apologetic story about a lease that had fallen through unexpectedly. Just until I find something else, he said, could he sleep on the couch a little while? I said, of course. What else does a man say to his wife's nephew standing in the rain with everything he owns in 2 bags? 6 weeks after that, Marlene called about a burst pipe at her rental, water damage bad enough that the landlord wanted the unit empty for repairs. Temporary, she said, just until the work's finished. Isla came with her, quiet in those early weeks, watching more than speaking, the way a kid does in an unfamiliar house. I remember setting up the guest room for the 2 of them myself, hauling in an extra dresser from the shed, telling myself it was a small thing, a season of inconvenience at most. The kind of favor any decent household extends to family passing through a hard stretch. I did not think much of any of it at the time. A full house felt, if anything, like a kind of proof that the loneliness Addie had worried about on her deathbed was being properly guarded against. I remember feeling almost grateful for the noise some evenings, the sound of more than 2 people moving through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. The garage changed slowly enough that I could never later identify the single day it stopped being mine. My workbench went first, pushed against one wall to make room, Priscilla said, for just a little extra storage while Marlene got back on her feet. Then a folding table appeared. Then a second sewing machine. Then sometime I genuinely cannot pin to a season, a hand-lettered sign went up over the door, and 11 strangers a month started paying deposits to walk through it. I asked once early on whether Marlene planned to find her own space, eventually a real shop somewhere in town. Priscilla had laughed not unkindly and said Marlene had never been much for standing on her own 2 feet. But that family took care of family, didn't it? And wasn't that exactly the kind of house she'd hoped we'd build together? I remember agreeing with her. I remember meaning it. Ren stopped coming into the garage to do her homework near me, while I worked on small engines the way she had done almost every evening since she was 7 years old. I noticed the absence vaguely the way you notice a sound has stopped, without immediately registering what the sound used to be. I told myself she was simply growing up, finding other places to spend her evenings the way 17-year-olds do. I did not ask her directly. I wish more than almost anything else from that year that I had simply asked her directly. It happened so gradually. I had not seen it happening at all, and standing in that garage a night ago with the power cut and my daughter's raw hands in front of me, I understood that gradual was exactly the point. I was still sitting with that thought. Gradual was exactly the point when a memory surfaced that I had not turned over in years, one small enough that I had filed it away at the time, as nothing more than a new girlfriend's polite curiosity. It was early, only a few months into dating, long before the wedding, before Cormac's duffel bags or Marlene's burst pipe or any of it. We were sitting on my porch one evening, coffee going cold between us. The kind of evening where a new relationship still feels like it is entirely made of easy questions, and Priscilla asked almost idly how I had originally won the town contract for the clock tower. Not what the work involved, which is the question most people ask. She wanted to know the history of the bid itself, who else had competed for it, whether the contract had ever changed hands before, and under what circumstances a town like Millhaven might decide to replace its clocksmith. I remember answering, easily flattered, that anyone found the administrative history of my trade interesting enough to ask about twice. I told her about the two other bidders from back then, one a firm out of Burlington, the other a single clocksmith working out of a shop, 2 towns over, a man who had lost the bid to me by a narrow margin, and from what I'd heard secondhand over the years, had struggled afterward. His business folded within a few years of losing that contract. I never learned the particulars beyond that. I remember mentioning it only because Priscilla asked twice what had become of him, and I had to admit I genuinely did not know. She had pressed once more gently, asking whether the town ever revisited old bids, whether a contract like mine could theoretically be reopened if circumstances changed. I told her I did not think so, that Millhaven had never once reopened a maintenance agreement mid-term in the 9 years I had held it, and she had nodded and let the subject drop as easily as she had raised it, moving on to ask about my late wife's garden instead, as though the two questions carried equal weight in her mind. At the time, I read the question as nothing more than attentiveness, the same quality that had drawn me to her from the dessert table that first night. I understand now that it might have been something else entirely, a woman gathering a piece of information she already had every reason to already possess, testing how much of the story I knew and how much I did not. I cannot say for certain, sitting here now, which reading is the true one. I only know the question stayed with me oddly. For 15 years, the way a loose thread stays in your pocket long after you've forgotten which garment it came from. I thought too about Cormac and the particular stillness of him that had bothered me from the first night, without my being able to name why. Every time I had walked into a room, he had one earbud and eyes on his phone, present in body, only offering nothing, absorbing nothing. Or so I had always assumed. I thought now about how often that phone had been angled a certain way, propped against something rather than held loosely in his hand, the screen facing outward at an angle that would have caught more of the room than his own face. I thought about the night in the garage, how quickly he had reached for the cash box the moment I cut the power, before he had reached for anything resembling concern about Ren at all, and how that instinct prioritizing the thing with resale value over the person standing beside it felt less like laziness now, and more like a habit somebody had trained into him deliberately. I did not know, sitting in that study, whether I was building a real pattern or simply seeing conspiracy in every idle habit, now that I had cause to distrust the whole house. I have learned in 34 years of diagnostic work that suspicion untethered from evidence is its own kind of malfunction, just as dangerous in its way as blind trust. So I did not act on the thought yet. I only wrote it down the way I write down every anomaly before I know whether it means anything, in the same small notebook where I had already started keeping dates and numbers of my own. There was one more piece of it that nagged at me, a smaller thing easy to overlook. Cormac had never once in 2 years asked me a single question about my work, my late wife, or anything about the family he had moved into. Most young men in his position, even lazy ones, manage a few polite questions out of simple social habit. Cormac had offered none ever, and I had read that silence as indifference for 2 years running. Sitting there, I began to wonder whether indifference was the wrong word entirely, and whether a person who already knows the answers to a set of questions has very little reason to ask them. I was still turning both of those thoughts over the bid history and the angled phone when a knock came at my study door. Soft, hesitant, nothing like the confident rap Priscilla used when she wanted my attention for something. I opened it to find Isla standing in the hallway in her pajamas, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red in a way that told me she had been crying for some time before she found the nerve to knock. She did not say anything at first. She just stood there looking at me the way a person looks at a door they have been standing in front of for a very long time, trying to decide whether they are finally going to walk through it. I asked her if she was all right. She shook her head slowly. "Can I come in?" she said. "There's something I need to tell you, and I don't think I can say it anywhere Aunt Marlene might hear." I stepped back and held the door open, the same way Corwin had held his open for me 2 mornings before, and I understood, watching her cross the threshold, that whatever she was about to say had likely been sitting in her for a very long time. The same way most of what I had learned that week had been sitting quietly in rooms I had simply never thought to enter. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the one Addie used to use for reading, and pulled her knees up to her chest, the way Ren had done in the sewing room 2 nights before, as though the two of them had learned the same posture from living under the same kind of pressure without ever comparing notes. She did not speak right away. She looked at the door once, checking it was fully closed, then looked back at me, and I could see her deciding in real time whether she still had a way to take the next sentence back once she said it. I told her she could take as long as she needed. I was not going anywhere. Isla did not speak for a long moment after she sat down. She stared at her own hands, picking at a loose thread on the hem of her pajama sleeve, and I waited the way I had learned to wait for Ren, letting the silence do whatever work it needed to do before words could follow it. "I've known about the garage for a while," she said finally. "Longer than you think. Since August, probably. I used to tell myself it wasn't as bad as it looked, that Ren was just helping out like the rest of us, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew it, and I didn't say anything, because I was scared of what would happen if Mom found out I'd said something. I asked her what she thought would happen. She looked up at me for the first time since she'd sat down. "Mom doesn't forgive people who make her look bad," she said. "Not even me. Especially not me, probably. I've watched her do it to other people my whole life, and I told myself it was different because I was her daughter, but I don't actually know that it is. Last year, she stopped speaking to her own sister for 4 months, over something much smaller than this. I did the math on that more than once lying awake, wondering what 4 months would turn into if it was me she stopped speaking to instead. I told her I understood, and that nothing she told me tonight was going to be used to punish her for staying quiet before now. I meant it. I am not certain, looking back, that I fully believed my own reassurance in the moment I gave it. But I needed her to keep talking more than I needed to be honest about my own uncertainty. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small spiral notebook. Similar in size to Wren's, the pages soft at the corners from handling. I started writing things down too, she said. Not as much as Wren. Just things I heard mostly. Things Aunt Priscilla said to Mom when they thought nobody else was listening. She opened the notebook to a page near the middle and handed it to me without reading it aloud herself. The entry was dated 6 weeks earlier, written in handwriting smaller and more cramped than the rest of the notebook, the way you write when you are trying to get something down exactly before you lose the wording. I read it twice to be sure I had it right. Once Wren turns 18 and leaves for college, we won't need to pretend anymore. Emmett's too lonely to question anything. I set the notebook down on the desk between us because my hands did not feel entirely steady holding it anymore. The house was quiet around us in a way it rarely was anymore. No bass thump from down the hall, no voices carrying up from the kitchen. Somewhere below us, the furnace kicked on a low mechanical sigh through the vents. Isla's fingers found the loose thread on her sleeve again, working it without seeming to notice she was doing it. Outside, a branch scraped once against the window, then stilled. Neither of us spoke for a while. I read the line a third time in my head, silently, before I trusted myself to ask anything else. I asked Isla where she had heard that. Standing outside the garage, she said. About 6 weeks ago. Aunt Priscilla was talking to Mom while they thought I was inside doing homework. I wrote it down as soon as I got back to my room because I was afraid I'd talk myself out of believing I'd actually heard it. Write the way you do sometimes, with things that are too awful to hold on to easily. She reached into her pocket again and pulled out a small envelope worn soft at the corners and set it on the desk beside the notebook. That's Wren's, she said. Tip money Mom skimmed off over the past few months. I started taking a little back out of the jar when I could, when Mom wasn't looking, and hiding it for her. I was always too scared to actually give it to her. I don't even really know why. I think I was scared that giving it to her would make it real, that I'd have to actually admit what I already knew was happening. I counted it later that night alone. $712 in loose bills of varying denominations, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. I did not say very much to Isla in that moment. There was a thing I understood sitting there looking at her that I chose not to say out loud because saying it felt like it would ask more of her than she had left to give that night. I understood that she was not simply a witness to what had happened to my daughter. She had been living inside a version of the same house, under a mother who had likely taught her the exact same lesson Wren had learned about silence keeping you safe, and that whatever courage it had taken her to walk down that hallway and knock on my door tonight had probably cost her more than either of us would ever fully know how to name. I thought of the way she'd pulled that notebook from her pocket at exactly the moment I'd needed proof, the way a person hands you something they have been carrying alone for so long that the handing itself becomes its own kind of confession. I asked her instead gently whether she had anywhere safe to go if it came to that. She said her mother's estranged mother, lived 40 minutes outside of town, and that they had not spoken in nearly 2 years, not since a falling out. None of the family discussed openly something about money her grandmother had lent Marlene years ago that never got repaid. I asked if she thought her grandmother would take her in regardless. She said she didn't know. She said she was more scared of asking and being told no than she had been of anything else that week, which, given everything else that week had contained, told me more about what she had been carrying than any notebook could have. I told her I would call in the morning on her behalf if she wanted and find out. She nodded, and for the first time since she had knocked, some of the tension went out of her shoulders, small but visible, the particular loosening of a person who has finally set down a weight they had stopped believing anyone else would help them carry. Tobias showed up at my kitchen table the next morning with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, and we worked through the plan the way we used to work through a stalled engine when we were younger. Men with more time and fewer responsibilities, piece by piece testing each connection before moving to the next. I want to do this in the open, I told him. Not a private conversation where she gets to manage the room the way she's managed every room in that house for 2 years. I want it in front of people who trust her so they can see for themselves what I've seen. Tobias asked if I was certain that was the right approach, or whether a quieter confrontation might spare everyone, including Ren, the exposure of doing this in front of a crowd. I told him I had already considered that more than once, lying awake the past several nights. I told him quiet had been my instinct my whole life in every part of it, and that quiet was exactly how this had been allowed to go on as long as it had. I was done trusting quiet to fix anything that actually mattered. He nodded slowly, the way a long-time friend nods when he has heard you arrive somewhere he suspected you were headed all along, and asked how I planned to get people there without tipping her off early. I told him the shop already had a reopening planned for that Saturday, a small celebration Priscilla had mentioned weeks ago before any of this meant to mark a year of the business. I intended to let that event happen exactly as scheduled. I would simply make sure the right people were standing in that garage when it did. We spent the morning building a guest list. Corwin and Betty, obviously. Dottie Reyes, who had already told me she would say what she'd seen to anyone who asked. Ingrid Lindqvist, if she was willing to come on a Saturday, since the drawings alone would mean more spoken about in a room than described secondhand. I called Marguerite Okafor as well, though I did not expect a school principal to attend a private family matter, and to my surprise she said she would try to be there off the clock, as a neighbor rather than an official. Priscilla had already sent out her own invitations for the reopening, a cheerful card with a photograph of the garage on the front, addressed to her actual client list, women who had no idea what they had actually been paying deposits toward. I did not remove a single name from that list. I wanted every one of them standing there too, so that whatever came out that afternoon would reach the exact people whose money and trust had been used to build it. Tobias handled the technical piece. He had wired sound systems for the volunteer fire department's annual auction for a decade, and he knew how to run a screen and speakers into a space without anyone noticing the cables until the moment they mattered. We ran the setup 2 nights before the event after Priscilla had gone to bed, working quietly in the garage with a single work lamp, testing the video files from Ren's phone against the screen resolution, making sure Corwin's photographs would read clearly from the back of the room. I did not tell Ren everything about the plan. I told her only that Saturday she would not have to go into that garage again unless she wanted to, and that if she did want to be there, I would be standing beside her the entire time. She thought about it for a long moment, sitting across from me at Tobias and Rosalind's kitchen table, turning her mother's mended earring between her fingers, the way she did when she was working something out that mattered to her. She said she wanted to be there. She said she had spent 5 months being talked about in that garage while people assumed she couldn't hear them. She wanted just once to watch someone else be talked about there instead. I asked her if she was certain. I told her she did not owe anyone, including me, the sight of her standing there. She said she knew that. She said she was not doing it for anyone else's sake. She was doing it because leaving that room for the last time from the outside on her own 2 feet mattered to her more than avoiding whatever ugliness might happen inside it one more time. I had one more call to make before the week was out, to Franklin Odom, walking him through exactly what evidence I intended to present, and in what order, making sure nothing I planned to say publicly would compromise the fraud claims already moving through the bank and the insurance carrier. He listened, asked a few sharp questions about sequencing, and told me the plan was sound, legally speaking, provided I did not physically remove anyone from the property myself. That part, he said, needed to go through the sheriff's office. If it came to it cleanly on paper, no room left for anyone to claim later that they'd been forced out unlawfully. If you're watching this, and you've ever sat on evidence like this, waiting for the right moment instead of the easiest one, you already know how long that week felt. And Priscilla moved through those final days entirely unaware, humming in the kitchen, confirming cake orders, telling me twice how relieved she was that we seemed to be finding our footing again after such a rough patch. She mentioned Thursday evening that she'd invited a reporter from the county paper's lifestyle section to cover the reopening, a small piece about local small businesses thriving after a hard year, and asked if I minded being in a photograph or two. I told her I did not mind at all. I meant that more sincerely than she understood. I let her believe the rest of it. I answered her questions the way I had learned to answer questions that week, evenly, without the smallest flicker, and I found that the easier the lying became, the more it cost me somewhere I could not quite locate, a debt I understood I would need to settle with myself eventually, once the more urgent debts were paid first. I am not a man who has ever been comfortable with deception, and I wanted understood that this discomfort did not disappear over that week. It simply moved somewhere. I could set it down temporarily, the way you set down a heavy tool mid-job, fully intending to pick it back up the moment the job allows. Friday night, Wren asked me quietly whether I thought her mother would have approved of what we were about to do. I told her I believed Addie would have approved of exactly one thing about all of it, which was that neither of us had done this alone. Everything else I said I would let Addie judge in her own time, whenever and however that judgment came. The night before the event, I lay awake a long while listening to the house settle the way houses do, the pipes ticking, the wind, finding the loose shingle above the guest room that I had meant to fix for over a year and somehow never had. Saturday, I thought. Saturday it gets kept. By 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon, the garage held more people than it had ever held in its life, even counting every wedding fitting Marlene had ever crammed into it. Folding chairs Tobias had borrowed from the fire hall lined 3 walls. Dottie sat in the front row beside Corwin and Betty. Marguerite Okafor stood near the door in a coat, the way a person stands when they have decided to attend something without fully deciding to be seen attending it. Ingrid Lindqvist stood beside her, a slim folder tucked under one arm. Priscilla's actual clients filled most of the remaining seats, 11 women in all, several holding small gift bags they had brought for the occasion, the way you bring something small to a shop's 1-year celebration. None of them yet understood what kind of afternoon this was actually going to be. Priscilla moved through the room in a soft gray dress, thanking people for coming, refilling a tray of lemon bars, entirely certain of the ground beneath her. Marlene stood near the sewing machines, arms crossed, watching the crowd fill in with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has finally built something people respect. Cormac leaned against the far wall, earbud in, as always, phone angled outward, the way I now noticed it always was. Wren stood beside me near the door we had come in through her hand, finding mine without either of us discussing it beforehand. I waited until Priscilla had finished her small welcome speech, thanking everyone for a wonderful first year before I stepped forward. I asked if I could say a few words too, as the man whose garage this technically still was, and the room laughed politely, the way rooms laugh at a husband's gentle joke at these kinds of gatherings. Priscilla laughed along with them, waving me forward with a warmth that had not yet noticed. It was standing on a floor, about to fall away. I looked out at the folding chairs, at faces I had known for years, and faces I was meeting for the first time that afternoon. And I found I did not have a prepared speech, after all. Only the plain truth I had been carrying around in my chest for 6 days, like a stone I could not set down anywhere convenient. I told the room that a year ago this garage had been a workbench, where I fixed small engines, and my daughter did her homework beside me most evenings. I told them that somewhere along the way, without my fully understanding when or how, it had become something else entirely, and that I wanted them to see in their own words and their own footage exactly what that something else had cost. I said I was not standing up here to embarrass anyone for sport. I said I was standing up here because I had spent 34 years fixing machines by tracing every failure back to its actual source. And I had decided 6 days ago that I owed my daughter the same honesty I had always given a broken bell. I nodded to Tobias, and the screen he had mounted against the back wall came to life. The first video was 14 seconds. Marlene sliding bills from the tip jar into her apron. A ripple went through the seated clients, the particular sound of people recognizing themselves in a story they had not known they were part of. Dottie said out loud, not quietly, "I always wondered where that money went." The second video followed immediately. Cormac dumping soiled linens onto Wren's workstation, saying, "These are yours now." I watched Cormac's face as his own voice played across the room. He did not look at the screen. He looked at the door, and I noticed for the first time in 2 years that he had gone very quickly still, in exactly the way a person goes still when they are calculating how far away the nearest exit actually is. A woman in the second row I recognized as a regular Tuesday client leaned toward Dottie and asked in a whisper loud enough to carry, "Isn't that the girl who does the alterations?" Dottie said, "That's Emmett's daughter," in a tone that made 3 more heads turn toward Wren at once. Wren did not look away from the screen. She stood beside me with her chin level, watching her own workstation appear in footage she had recorded herself. The way a person watches something they have already survived once and refuses to flinch from a second time. Marlene's voice cut through the murmuring before the third video finished loading. "What is this?" she said, stepping forward, her arms uncrossing. "Emmett turned that off." I did not turn it off. I told the room calmly that they had just watched footage taken inside this garage over the past several months, and that there was more, including a financial pattern I had confirmed personally at the bank 3 days earlier, involving withdrawals from my daughter's college fund that none of us had ever authorized. The 11 clients in the folding chairs had gone very still. One woman near the back stood up slowly, her gift bag still in her hand, looking at Marlene with an expression I recognized, because I had likely worn it myself in Louisa's back office 3 days before. Marlene turned toward Priscilla, then fast, her voice sharp enough to cut through the low murmur that had started building around the room. You told me he wouldn't check the accounts, she said. You told me he never looks past what you tell him. The room went fully silent. The particular silence of 40 people simultaneously realizing they are watching something they were not meant to see. Priscilla's face did something I had never once seen it do in 2 years of marriage. For half a second, before she caught herself, every practiced softness dropped away entirely, and what was left underneath looked nothing like the woman who had asked me about pendulums at a dessert table 15 years ago. It looked like someone doing arithmetic very quickly, trying to calculate how much of the room she could still save. She recovered faster than I expected. She turned toward the seated clients with both hands raised, palms out, the same gesture she used whenever she wanted a room to slow down and listen to her instead of each other. "This is clearly a misunderstanding," she said, her voice pitched to carry a family disagreement Emmett and I should be having in private, not in front of paying customers. One of the clients, a woman I did not recognize, stood up fully now, gift bag set down on her chair. "I paid a $400 deposit for a dress 3 weeks ago," she said. "Is that money actually going toward my dress? Or is it going into whatever this is?" Priscilla did not answer that question directly. She did not get the chance to answer it at all before Marlene kept going. "You knew," Marlene said, rounding fully on Priscilla now, her voice climbing past anything resembling control. "You knew this whole time, and you let me be the one standing here with my name on the sign." Priscilla did not answer her yet. She was looking at me instead, calculating still, though I could see the calculations narrowing, fewer paths left open to her with every second that passed in that silent room. I nodded to Tobias again. The bank statement appeared on the screen behind me, the withdrawal history enlarged, so the numbers were legible from the back row. $26,100 highlighted in a column beside 31 separate dates. A murmur went through the seated clients, sharper this time, less curious than accusatory. "That's not possible," Priscilla said. But her voice had lost the smooth, managed quality it had carried all afternoon. That account required both signatures. I told her calmly that Louisa Whitcomb at Millhaven Savings had confirmed otherwise 3 days earlier, and that the fraud department was already reviewing every transaction against her authorization code specifically. Priscilla's composure, which had survived Marlene's outburst and the first murmur of the crowd, did not survive that sentence. Something in her face gave way entirely, the practiced softness collapsing into something harder and much older, a version of her I had genuinely never seen before, not once in 15 years. "You have no idea what you cost me," she said, her voice rising, no longer performing for the room at all, speaking now only to me, as though the 40 other people crowded into that garage had simply stopped existing. 15 years, Emmett. 15 years, and you never even knew his name." I asked her whose name she meant. "Desmond," she said. "Desmond Voss, my husband. My real husband before you, before any of this. He bid against you for that tower contract, and he lost, and losing it broke something in him that never came back. He drank. He stopped working. I watched him fold in on himself for 3 years before I finally left, and every single week of those 3 years, I watched this town keep paying you to fix that bell like nothing had happened. Like the man who'd lost everything over it didn't exist at all." The room had gone completely still. Even Marlene had stopped talking. I asked her quietly whether she believed I had somehow caused that. I told her I had won a fair bid against 2 other clocksmiths, one of whom I had genuinely never met, and that I had not known Desmond's name until this exact moment. "That doesn't matter," she said, and her voice cracked on the word matter, the first crack I had ever heard in it. It doesn't matter whether you meant it. You got to keep everything. The contract, the town's respect, a whole life built on the thing that took mine apart. I decided a long time ago that if I couldn't get any of it back from him, I'd get it back from whoever was still standing where he should have been. I understood standing there that she was telling the truth for the first time since I had known her, and that the truth was worse than anything I had imagined sitting in that cold truck outside Tobias and Rosalind's house 6 nights earlier. This had never been about loneliness or opportunity or even simple greed. It had been about me specifically, from the very first conversation at that dessert table calculated 15 years in the making, built slowly and patiently around a wound I had never known I was standing inside of. I thought, standing in that garage with 40 pairs of eyes on me, about every kindness I had credited to her over 2 years of marriage. The lunch notes, the remembered small details, the warmth that had made me believe I had found my way back to something whole after Addie. I understood now that none of it had been separate from the plan. It had been the plan, the careful, patient architecture of it executed so well that I had spent 2 years mistaking a demolition for a homecoming. I asked her because I needed to hear the answer, even standing in front of a full room, whether any part of the last 15 years had been real, or whether all of it, every question about the pendulum, every note in Wren's lunch, had simply been the long, patient execution of a plan laid before we ever met. She did not answer that question directly. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression flickered uncertain, as though she was not entirely sure of the answer herself anymore. 15 years, and one marriage deep into a plan she might have started believing in along the way. I did not have anything else to say to that. Some repairs I understood in that moment cannot be made with words at all. I nodded to Tobias one final time, and he cut the power to the whole garage. The screen went dark. The overhead lights died with it. For a moment, the only sound in that crowded room was 40 people breathing in a space gone suddenly completely black, the cold afternoon light leaking thin around the edges of the closed bay door. Somewhere near the back, a folding chair scraped against concrete. A child brought along by one of the clients asked in a small, clear voice why the lights went out and was immediately shushed. The smell of the lemon bars still hung faintly in the cold air, sweet and strange against everything that had just happened. Nobody spoke. I stood in the dark and let the silence hold for longer than was comfortable, because I understood that some truths need a moment of darkness to actually land before anyone can be expected to respond to them. When Tobias brought the emergency lantern up from behind the folding table, casting everyone in a pale, uneven glow, I spoke into that half-light, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be. I told Priscilla, Marlene, and Cormac that they had 30 days to vacate my house. I told the 11 clients that Dottie would be helping me arrange refunds for any deposits still outstanding starting Monday. I told the room the reopening was over. Nobody argued. Nobody in that lantern light seemed to have anything left to argue with. I took Wren's hand, and we walked out through the crowd together, past faces I had known for years, and faces I had met only that afternoon, past Dottie, who reached out briefly to touch Wren's shoulder as we passed past Corwin, who simply nodded, once the nod of a man confirming that a debt of silence had finally been paid in full. We stepped out into the cold, gray light of a Saturday that had started as somebody else's celebration and ended as mine. The parking area outside was full of cars belonging to people who had come expecting cake and lemon bars and had instead watched a marriage come apart on a projector screen. Nobody lingered by their vehicles the way people usually do after a small town gathering, trading a few last words before driving off. They moved quickly, heads down, the particular hurried courtesy of people who have witnessed something they know is not theirs to discuss loudly in a parking lot. Behind us, the arguing started before we had even reached the truck. Marlene left first on the 9th day, loading her sewing equipment into a rented van before dawn, while I sat in the kitchen with coffee I did not drink. She did not say goodbye. She left a key on the counter and a note that said only, "Tell Isla I love her," which struck me reading it as the truest sentence I had heard from her in the entire 2 years I had known her. I heard later secondhand through Dottie that Marlene had set up shop briefly in the next town over, using a different name for the business, and that word had traveled fast enough through the county's small network of hairdressers and the seamstresses that her first 2 clients had canceled within a week. I did not take any satisfaction in that. I only noted it the way you note that a removed part has genuinely stopped functioning elsewhere too. Confirmation that the failure had been in the part itself, and not simply in the system it had been operating inside. Cormac stayed longer, filling his days with a version of packing that mostly involved sitting on the porch on his phone. On the 12th day, I woke to find the back door pried open at the frame, a thin gap where the deadbolt had been forced from the outside. I walked through the house before calling anyone the way I walk a mechanism, before I diagnose it looking for what was missing, rather than what was broken. Addie's fireproof box, the one that held her jewelry, and the letters she had written me the year she was sick, had been pulled from the closet shelf and emptied onto the bedroom floor. Most of it was still there, scattered but intact. The one thing missing was a small brass gear pendant on a chain, the one Addie had worn every day of our marriage, the one I had been saving to give Wren on her 18th birthday. Tobias had installed a small security camera above the back door 2 weeks earlier, part of the same setup he'd used for the reopening, and I had never gotten around to taking it down. The footage showed Cormac clearly time-stamped 4:15 that morning, working the door frame with a flathead screwdriver, moving through the house with the ease of someone who already knew exactly where everything was kept, because he had spent 2 years watching where everything was kept. I called him. He did not answer the first 2 times. On the third, I told him I had clear footage time-stamped and that I intended to file a police report within the hour unless the pendant was on my porch within 40 minutes. It was there in 35, dropped through the mail slot in a sandwich bag, no note attached. I thought about the phone habit I had noticed weeks earlier, the way it had always seemed angled slightly outward, catching more of the room than his own face. I still do not know for certain whether Cormac had ever actually recorded anything inside that house beyond what Wren had captured herself. I only know that a young man who moves through a home with that kind of practiced silent attention rarely does so by accident, and that whatever he had been keeping for himself, he had at least understood in the end when the cost of getting caught outweighed whatever leverage he thought he was holding on to. Priscilla's departure took the longest and unfolded in 3 distinct movements, the way a difficult repair sometimes reveals a new problem each time you think you have finally solved the last one. The first movement on day 3 was tears. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, said she was sorry in every configuration of the word she could find, said she had lost herself somewhere along the way, and did not fully recognize the woman I had described that Saturday afternoon. She reached for my hand at one point, and I let her take it briefly before pulling it back, not out of cruelty, but because I needed her to understand that the gesture no longer meant what it once had. I listened. I did not argue with her account of herself. I simply told her the 30 days still stood. The second movement on day 7 was negotiation. She proposed we sell the house together and split the proceeds evenly, framed as fairness, as though evenness itself were a kind of apology. She brought printed comparables from 3 houses on the next street, over numbers already circled, the same careful preparation I remembered admiring in her once, back when I had believed that carefulness was evidence of love rather than evidence of something else entirely. I told her Franklin was already handling the property, and that any conversation about the house needed to go through him from that point forward. The third movement on day 28. The last day of the 30 was something closer to grief or its convincing imitation. She stood in the driveway beside her packed car and asked if I understood what I was choosing a house with, just the two of us in it again, quiet the way it had been before her, before any of it. "You'll be alone again," she said. I told her I would rather be alone than have my daughter afraid in her own home. She did not have an answer for that. She got into the car, and I watched her taillights go small down Birch Hollow Road, and I stood in the driveway a while afterward in the cold. Not because I needed to watch her leave completely, but because I wanted to feel all the way through what the silence that came after actually sounded like. It sounded, I found, like nothing being hidden anywhere in the house behind me. I had not realized how loud that particular kind of quiet could be until I finally had it back. I went back inside once the cold had worked its way fully through my coat, and I walked the house slowly, room by room, the way I had walked it the night I found Wren in the garage, except this time I was checking for something different. Not evidence, just space. The hallway closet had room in it again. The kitchen table had exactly 2 chairs pulled out from breakfast that morning, instead of 5. I stood in the doorway of what had briefly been Cormac's room, now empty, the carpet still bearing the faint indentation of a bed frame that was no longer there. And I understood that emptiness, after everything that room had cost my daughter, was its own kind of repair, even if it did not look like much yet. 2 months passed before I finally worked up the resolve to clear out the room that had briefly belonged to Priscilla, the one that had been Addie's sewing room before either of them the one Wren had slept in on a camping mattress for 5 months, while nobody with the power to stop it thought to look inside. I had left it untouched since the eviction closed door. The kind of avoidance I am not proud of, but will not pretend I did not choose. Some part of me, I think, was not ready to walk back into that particular room and confront everything it had held. It was a Saturday, cold and bright, when I finally opened that door with a stack of empty boxes and the intention of turning the room back into something useful, a proper studio for Wren, who had started drawing again in earnest. Warmer subjects now, though not entirely warm yet. I worked through the closet, first Priscilla's leftover boxes stacked in the back, mostly forgotten linens, and an old sewing pattern collection she had never used. The pegboard was still there, Addie's shears still hanging from it, and I took a moment longer than I meant to, just standing in front of them, remembering a version of that room from a decade earlier that had nothing to do with any of this. Near the bottom of the stack, wedged behind a loose panel in the closet wall I nearly missed entirely, was a manila folder sealed with a rubber band gone brittle with age. I sat down on the bare floor and opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, dated across more than a year, the earliest entry marked 14 months before our wedding day. A sketch, crude but detailed, of my garage floor plan, with the sewing table positioned exactly where it would eventually sit. A second sketch of the room I was sitting in at that moment, labeled in Priscilla's neat hand "Private Quarters," with a note beside it, reading, "Emmett will need this eventually better to establish the arrangement early, while he's still grateful rather than resistant." A third page listed dates and ages, a timeline tracking my own retirement eligibility at the tower, my age at various future points. A column headed Possible Health Decline with rough estimates penciled beside it in a hand that had clearly done this kind of calculation before on someone else. A fourth page near the bottom of the stack was simply a list of names, mine, Wren's, Desmond's, each followed by a short phrase I did not fully understand and did not care to ask anyone to explain. I read every page twice. I want to be honest that I do not remember reading it the second time whether I was breathing normally. I called Wren in from the kitchen, where she had been making tea, and I did not soften anything for her. I set the folder in front of her and let her read it herself the same way I had let her hand me the notebook and the phone 6 months earlier. Because I had learned by then that softening the truth for someone strong enough to hold it plainly was its own kind of dishonesty. She read slowly, page by page, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside me, the kettle forgotten and going cold in the kitchen behind us. I watched her face do something I had not seen it do since the night I found her in the garage, a kind of settling, the particular stillness of a person finally seeing the full shape of a thing they had only ever felt in pieces. She paused longest on the third page, the one with my retirement timeline penciled beside it, running her finger slowly under the column marked Possible Health Decline, as though she needed to touch the words to fully believe an adult had written them about her father in advance. The way you might plan a renovation. It was never about us at all, she said quietly when she finished. It was planned before we were even a real family. Before any of it was real. I told her I believed that was true. I told her, too, that believing it did not make the 2 years before it any less real to me, that a person could be the target of a plan and still have genuinely loved parts of what grew out of it, confused as that felt to say out loud. She listened to that without agreeing or disagreeing, which felt at the time like exactly the right amount of room to leave the question open. She sat with the folder in her lap for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. And then she said the only thing either of us said for a while after that. "Burn it," she said. I asked if she was certain. She nodded, and something in the nod carried more conviction than anything she had said to me in the 6 months since that New Year's night. I have thought since about how strange it is that a 17-year-old girl could sound more settled in that moment than I felt. But grief and clarity, I have learned, do not always arrive on the same schedule for two people living through the same wound. We carried it together to the fireplace in the living room, the one we had not used much that winter, and I built a small fire while Wren tore the pages loose from the folder one at a time, feeding them in, slowly watching each one curl and blacken and disappear. Neither of us spoke while it burned. The fire made its own small sounds, the pop and hiss of paper catching the settle of ash falling through the grate. A log shifted and dropped further into the coals, sending up a brief spray of sparks that Wren watched rise and fade without flinching. The room smelled of wood smoke and something faintly chemical from the ink burning away. Outside, a car passed slowly on Birch Hollow Road, headlights sweeping once across the front window and gone. Wren sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it, knees pulled up, watching the last page go. And when the final corner finally curled into nothing, she let out a long breath, slow, and even the sound of something she had been holding for a very long time, finally being given permission to leave her. I did not tell her in that moment that I was burning something of my own, alongside her pages, a belief I had carried for 34 years, that quiet, careful maintenance was enough to keep a house standing on its own. I let the fire take that too silently, and did not ask her to notice. Some things I have found repair better when nobody watches you set them down. Wren's 18th birthday fell on a bright, cold Saturday in October. 10 months almost exactly from the night I had come home to find her scrubbing hair dye off a garage floor that no longer existed in any form I recognized. I made her mother's birthday breakfast that morning, the one Addie used to make every year without fail, scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar and chives from the small pot that somehow survived every winter on the kitchen windowsill. I had not made it since Addie died 5 years now, unable to bring myself to try and inevitably fall short of a recipe I had never actually written down, only watched 100 times over 100 birthdays. I got it mostly right. Wren said it tasted exactly like she remembered, though I suspect she would have told me that regardless, and I found I did not mind either way. The house filled slowly over the course of the afternoon, the way houses do on the good kind of occasion, one car in the driveway becoming 3, becoming 6. Tobias and Rosalind arrived first. Rosalind carrying a cake she had clearly spent the entire morning on. Corwin and Betty came next, Corwin handing me a small wrapped frame before he'd even taken his coat off one of the 23 photographs he said, the one he thought Wren should have on her own wall now instead of in a folder that had once been evidence. Dottie arrived with a check for the shop's final settled refunds, insisting on handing it to Wren directly, rather than me, some kind of point she wanted made about whose money it had always actually been. Ingrid Lindqvist came too off the clock the way Marguerite had been that Saturday, months before, carrying a fresh sketchbook instead of a gift bag. Blank pages, she said, for whatever Wren wanted to put in them next. Isla arrived last, driving herself the 2 hours from her grandmother's house, where she had settled in more fully than any of us had expected. That first frightened week. She and Wren had exchanged messages steadily over the months since, careful at first and warmer with time and watching them fall into easy conversation. On the porch steps, heads bent together over something on Isla's phone, I understood that whatever this new shape of family looked like, it had assembled itself the way most good things do, slowly and mostly without my direct involvement. I found myself at one point in the afternoon, standing at the kitchen sink with a plate in my hand, watching the whole gathering through the window over the counter, and thinking about how few of the people filling my house that day would have been there a year earlier. Corwin, who I had barely spoken to beyond a wave across the fence line. Dottie, who I had known only as a name on Priscilla's appointment book. Isla, who I had not so much as met until she stood shaking in my study doorway 6 months ago. None of them had been obligated to any of this. Each one had simply decided at some point along the way that Wren and I were worth showing up for, and I understood, standing there with a wet plate cooling in my hand, that this was its own kind of repair too, one I could not have managed alone, no matter how carefully I had tried. I gave Wren her gift after the cake. Once the crowd had thinned to the people who would stay for the quieter part of the evening. It was the pendant, cleaned and restrung on a new chain, the small brass gear that had been Addie's every day of our marriage. The one I had promised myself I would give Wren on this exact birthday, long before any of the last 10 months had happened, and the one I had briefly feared, watching it disappear into a sandwich bag through a mail slot. I might never actually get to give her at all. She held it in her palm for a long moment, before putting it on. Running her thumb over the small engraved teeth of the gear, the way I had watched her mother do 1,000 times. She did not say much. She did not need to. Some gifts carry their own weight without requiring a single word from the person receiving them, and this I understood, watching her fasten the clasp herself, was one of those. Later, once most of the guests had gone and only Tobias and Rosalind remained inside washing dishes, Wren and I sat together on the back porch steps. The cold coming up through the wood, both of us wrapped in the same old quilt from the hall closet. The way we used to sit some evenings when she was small, before Priscilla, before any of it, back when the hardest thing either of us had to think about was whether it would snow before Christmas. She told me she used to count the days on purpose back in that room, not just marking time, but genuinely believing most nights that nobody was coming for her at all, that the counting itself was the only thing she actually controlled. I told her I was sorry it took me as long as it did. She did not offer easy forgiveness for that, and I did not ask her to. She sat quietly for a while, turning the pendant over between her fingers, and then she said something I had not expected. She said she had once or twice in the worst weeks imagined what it would be like to simply stop counting, to stop expecting anyone at all, and how frightening it had been to notice how close she had come to actually doing that, to letting go of the belief that a door might eventually open. She said she was telling me this now a year later because she thought I should understand exactly how close it had been. Not to make me feel worse, but because she thought honesty between us was the only kind worth having going forward. I did not have a smooth answer for that either. I only told her I would spend whatever years I had left, making sure she never had reason to reach that particular edge again, and that I understood a promise like that could only be proven true one ordinary day at a time, not spoken into existence all at once. She only leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was 7 years old, and still did her homework beside me while I worked on small engines in a garage that had for a long stretch stopped being anyone's safe place at all. We sat like that for a while, not talking, watching the last of the light go out of the yard, the porch light Tobias had left on inside casting a warm yellow rectangle across the grass. From somewhere across town, faint but unmistakable, the tower chime rang out the hour full and steady and precisely on time. The first evening in months, I had noticed it ringing exactly as it should, without a single hesitation in the mechanism, without a single beat out of place. Neither of us said anything about it. We just sat there and let it finish all the way through before either of us moved the sound, carrying clean across the cold October air, the way it had every evening for 34 years, and the way I found myself believing it might finally keep doing for a good while longer. A year after that, on a morning, I almost overslept, for I found a small pencil drawing waiting on my desk before I'd even had coffee. My own kitchen table, 2 mugs, steaming a chair pulled out on the near side like someone was expected. No caption. She didn't need one. I set it against the lamp where it still sits, catching the morning light every day since, and went to open the tower for the day, the chime already sounding clean and full across the square before I'd even reached the stairs. The way it should have all along the way, it finally does now every single morning, without fail. For 34 years, I believed a house like a clock could be kept running on quiet maintenance alone. That love mostly meant not disturbing what still seemed to be ticking. I know better now. Some gears only turn true again once somebody is willing to say out loud plainly that they have slipped. My daughter taught me that days before I ever managed to teach it to myself, and I have spent the time since trying to catch up to her courage rather than the other way around. The old belief and the new one sit side by side in me still, some mornings, arguing most mornings, simply agreeing that the second one cost more and was worth it. I don't think I would have chosen it on my own. I'm grateful in the end that I didn't have to. I think of her most on quiet evenings, the sound of a car she isn't in. Yet pulling into a driveway, a chair I still half expect empty. God gave me 34 years of fixing things that couldn't answer back, And then in one cold winter, God asked something harder of me to fix the one thing that could. I don't know that I've finished. I don't know that a father ever does. But I go to sleep most nights now, believing God willing that I finally started, and that whatever years are left to me, I intend to spend them awake to what's actually in front of me, instead of only what's convenient to notice. If you were the one standing outside that window looking in, what would it have taken for someone to notice you were still out there? Tell me in the comments, honestly, the way you'd tell somebody who actually stayed to listen. If this found its way to you today, share it with the person who needs to hear that noticing is still possible even years after they've stopped expecting it. And if you want more evenings like this, one quiet, honest, worth staying for, stay with us. Subscribe. We'll be here the next time you need somewhere to sit with it.